begin.
All right, my English teacher friends, I got a good one for us today. So it's got a little bit of a background story, so let me start there. So I've been teaching AP literature now. I just finished my 24th year, and one of the things that I'm really blessed and thankful for is that during that entire span of time, my department has had the following policy. AP teachers at the end of the exam, when the exams are released, we sit down and take them under the exact same conditions that our students did. So we all sat down in a room the other day when the exams were released, and we took the exam minus the multiple choice isn't released, but we wrote all three FRQs. And in this writing workshop, I'm going to show you FRQ1, which is Marking Time by Christopher Gilbert. And what we did was this. So in my department, we use heuristics. I know a lot of you guys use templates and frames and little scaffolding, things of that nature. We use something called heuristics. So what you'll see is you'll see my writing samples, and you'll see some of my colleagues. We use something known as the inverted thesis heuristic for our introductory paragraphs, and we do this for FRQ1 and FRQ2. But then kind of special and unique to us is we use something called the syllogistic method to house the body paragraphs. It's a Aristotelian heuristic that works really well, especially for the AP literature exam, and it seems to set our kids up well for success. So that's what we'll walk you through this. So it's just kind of how to cobble the whole essay together from start to finish. So hopefully you enjoy it, and it can be of benefit to you and your students, your instruction and their learning. So sit in, strap up, and check this one out. All right, without further ado, let's unpack this prompt together. So it's pretty simplistic and straightforward, kind of common fodder for College Board FRQ1. So it says, in Christopher Gilbert's poem, Marking Time, published in 1984, the speaker observes his surroundings during a morning jog. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Gilbert uses literary elements and techniques to convey the speaker's complex reflections while jogging. So I don't think this is overly unsettling to any kid. If they've gone through the gamut of AP test prep, they've seen prompts like this 1,000 times. So not that tricky. So the question becomes, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as I alluded to earlier, my kids use something called the inverted thesis heuristic. But here's the kicker with this. It's kind of like a hack or a cheat code for the exam. Implicit in the language of FRQ1, and I'll make a video for FRQ2, and we'll just hit rinse and repeat on this. Implicit in the prompt are two questions. The first is, what is the author's intent? And the second is, how does the author construct meaning? And what my students do is this, and I indicated it here with the number system. They riff what is the author's intent for 3 sentences. Those are the opening 3 sentences of the piece. And then they riff 1 sentence construction of meaning. So it's a 3 plus 1. So the introductory paragraph is going to be 4 sentences long. The reason why we call it an inverted thesis is because whenever you respond to the question, how does the author construct meaning, that constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. So the thesis statement comes last, hence why we call it inverted versus declarative. So if we break this down visually, it's kind of like an upside down triangle. And I want to make sure that my students have sufficient tier 2 level vocabulary in this. And what I mean is that they just use a fair amount of tier 2 level words. It is an academic audience, so they should cop an academic tone. With that, in my YouTube channel, I've done a lot of work on sentence constructs. I'm a stickler for voice, rhythm, and flow. And I know that typically my young, struggling, emerging writers overuse independent clauses. So you get this tone that goes chop, 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 chop. It's very monotonous and droning. So to create the musicality of their voice, I want them to cook their sentence constructs. Verbs are very important, so I'm looking for active verbs. You need a little bit of context and background, but you want to be careful not to get overly plot summative on this. And then, as I already said, you end with the thesis. It's just a classic 3+1. So with our students in my district, we do something called Bob Rossing our instruction. So my colleagues and I are in the habit of getting to the proverbial easel and canvas, and we paint with and for our students. So during our writing workshops, it's very common for us to be seated at our desk with our projectors on, and we'll say, so kids, we're going to write an inverted thesis. Here's one, and we talk through the process. Here it is again. I often model 3 times, especially early in the year. And then I say, all right, you've seen it 3 times. On your mark, get set, go, do it on your own. And I find that that really helps demystify the process and solidify and shore up what we're doing exactly with the heuristics. So enough of that. Let's paint a few and see what we got. And again, these are written by teachers. So here's the first one. Beneath the speaker's morning jog lies a deeper attempt to find stability within the constant passage of time. So you can see you start with the author's intent, kind of the big aha moment or the Jesus moment of the poem. The poem suggests that memory emerges not through deliberate reflection, but through brief encounters with the natural world that trigger emotional recognition. So we're 2 sentences in, still riffing that author's intent. As physical movement gives way to inward contemplation, the speaker discovers that human connection survives through remembrance. Look at this last sentence here, because this is kind of our shift. We got to get into the construction of meaning. Ideally, I don't want my students to have a dumping ground of literary terms, devices, and techniques. I know that some teachers advise their kids to imply this. I think sometimes you might be at risk of, precluding the kid from getting the thesis point if it's too subtly implicated. So I tell my kids to go a little bit with explication on this. In Marking Time, Christopher Gilbert reinforces this idea through breath-like syntax and shifting natural imagery that echo the speaker's steady motion and wandering consciousness. So that's a classic 3+1. So just eyeball those verbs for a second. They're pretty active. I don't want my students saying uses. We have a forbidden word wall. Oftentimes my students will say kind of inane things like the speaker uses diction. And I'm like, nah. So get better than that with your verbs. You can also note that all the sentence constructs are varied. So it's got a good musicality to it. It's got a good pulse. I advise my students not to parallel their syntax. I think that creates a very droning, monotonous tone and flavor to it. So it's all there, classic 3+1. So let's paint another one and take a look at sample number 2. Again, it's written by a teacher, so they're good examples for students to see. A morning routine of jogging gradually becomes a meditation on how memory surfaces beneath ordinary experience. The natural world takes on emotional weight, suggesting that brief sensory encounters can reconnect the speaker to enduring human relationships. As physical exertion gives way to reflection, the speaker recognizes that remembrance offers a fragile form of permanence against time's movement. So 3 sentences of author's intent. Let's slip in the construction of meaning sentence. In Marking Time, Christopher Gilbert develops this meaning through fluid syntax and layered natural imagery that mirror the rhythm of running and recollection. So it's done exactly the same way. And this gets really cool because FRQ2 can be written the exact same way. It's fantastic, especially in a grueling timed exam like this where the kids have 2 hours to write 3 essays. They can't be configuring things out in their head, like what goes into an introduction, what are the moves I need to take. Oftentimes, like memorizing sentence stems, I think kind of stifles them a little bit, and it might not be fitting for the particular poem. So I think these heuristics yield nice, organic, supple writing. So I always model things 3 times, as I said. So let's see it again. A sequence of physical movement through landscape shifts into inward reflection as fleeting moments in nature trigger unexpected memories of familial connection. These moments suggest that emotional bonds persist beyond distance and time, re-emerging through sensory detail. The speaker's effort to track progress outwardly becomes an inward discovery of continuity and presence. So that's the 3, right? All author's intent is a big thematic umbrella. Last sentence, construction of meaning. In marking time, Christopher Gilbert constructs meaning through enjambment and recurring natural imagery that echo breath, motion, and the gradual unfolding of thought. So I could show you 100 of these and we would do them exactly the same way. 3 plus 1. 3 authors' intent, 1 construction of meaning. Keep the verbs active, cook the sentence constructs. And then, come exam time for my students, they're just at the mercy of the poem that's hurled their way. And if they can read it correctly, and ascertain its meaning accurately, they should be off and running. So the next question becomes, so how about the bodies? How do I do that? And I've already hinted that my students use something called the syllogistic method. So there's a little bit of history to this that I'll go over briefly. I talk about this a lot in my writing workshops in my YouTube channel. But in brief, it's an Aristotelian heuristic. Aristotle ran the Lyceum, and the rich town folks, the boys, would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate. And they'd often tussle with these pithy essential questions that we see in Plato's Republic as an example, the essential question of what is justice. So these philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, just like us composition teachers, said, some of these kids have a really great knack for being cogent and articulate and really locked in logically, and some kids are just kind of mad at it, and some kids tank bomb it. So what he did was figuratively open up the lid of the brain of the better orators, and he said, I got to figure out like the internal machinations of what these students are doing. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, aha, the better orators are using sort of this quasi-mathematical formula that goes premise 1, premise 2 to a conclusion. So let me give you an example of this. If I were to say arsenic is deadly, you would all nod your heads and say, yep, Christian, you are 100% correct. And then premise 2 is where you slip in your textual support. So if I were to give you the following context, it would yield a natural conclusion. So if I were to say, this morning I woke up to make a cup of coffee, and out of the corner of my eye, I spot Pickle, my dog, beneath the kitchen counter sink. And the cupboard doors are wide open. And I say, oh no, Pickle. And he looks at me sheepishly, and he's got white stuff all over his muzzle and his grizzle. Little do you know that last night before going to bed, I sprinkled arsenic underneath the kitchen cupboard because we have a rat infestation problem. What are you going to naturally conclude? Aha! That's not going to bode well for Pickle the dog. Pickle's probably going to die, right? We created a logic bubble there. What Aristotle would call cogency. It's basic logos, right, in terms of this. So if we morph that heuristic and turn it into a heuristic for the purposes of doing FRQ1 and FRQ2, here's what we got. And you might want to write down the math to this because it's kind of calculative here. So the first premise is going to be an argument containing the terms, techniques, and devices. I usually tell my kids to go the route of implication here. You don't want to, like if you explicitly say the lit terms up top in the thesis, to ensure that you get the thesis point, you probably want to imply because you don't want layers of redundancy. The math behind this is like this. First premise is always going to be 3 sentences long. And here's the reason why I stipulate this. All too often when I read literary analysis, the students aren't performing literary analysis with fidelity. They are actually writing plot synopsis or plot summary, plot analysis. So if they keep their argument central for 3 sentences, they should, by default, fulfill the demands of the assignment and write a literary analysis. So beginning in the 4th sentence, I want them to get in their textual support, and they can do a blend of paraphrasing and direct quote. And then the conclusion of the body paragraph, and I want to be mindful of that. I'm not talking about the conclusion paragraph of the essay. Body paragraphs need to be concluded, and this is where you're going to get in your textual analysis or your commentary. Ultimately, the syllogism comes full circle on itself, and you throw it back to the prompt and the thesis. In terms of total math, a syllogistic body paragraph is going to be about 10 to 12 sentences. So let's ask ourselves this. What's a first premise look like? I got a couple of examples for us, and I have a stem that my students use. So at the beginning of every first paragraph, they say something like this, right from the onset. Students often ask where to begin their analysis, and I tell them go chronologically through the piece. Have a good methodology as you proceed through this, and just sort of cross weave when necessary. So when they say right from the onset, you're cueing your reader into knowing that you have a chronological, methodological approach to this, and that you're going to be very cogent. It's an easy way to set up the line of reasoning. So they say right from the onset, the poem establishes a flowing, unbroken syntax that mirrors the breath and rhythm of a jogger in motion. The extended sentence structure pulls thought forward without pause, mimicking both physical exertion and the continuity of consciousness during movement. Within this sustained rhythm, memory becomes immediately entangled with the natural world, suggesting that perception and recollection are inseparable from the speaker's experience of landscape and breath. So you can see there, apart from explicitly stating syntax, a lot of it's implied, but it's literary in focus, right? You don't want to get into plot analysis here or plot summary or just regurgitating the storyline of the poem. So that's a perfect example there. It takes 3 sentences, and let's see it again just to really demystify it and shore it up. Here's another one written by another teacher. Right from the onset, memory shows up as something that's already active, slipping in through small details of nature and everyday movement. Those early moments suggest that remembering isn't separate from what's happening outside, but gets triggered by what the speaker sees and feels while moving. At the same time, the long flowing syntax keeps everything going in one steady breath, mirroring how thought and motion blur together during the jog. So it's always 3 sentences, heavy on the literary focus. I think implication goes a long way in this. I don't want them to be overly explicit or use the first premise as this sort of dump truck of you come into your first premise and then just dump a whole bunch of terms, devices, techniques in there. So it takes a little bit of practice. So once you're done with that first premise, you transition to the second premise. And we also have a stem for this, and it's very simple. We say immediately, because this again cues your reader going to that you're going back to right from the onset. So whatever you promised first in the first premise necessitates what you're going to quote in the 4th line. So the immediately goes back to the right from the onset. So in this way, quote selection isn't arbitrary. The line of reasoning stays really intact and is thoughtful. You end up as what Aristotle would call cogent in it. So this particular example says, immediately memory starts to surface through nature as the speaker runs under the blue sky is a memory like a sheer silk fabric held so far back I can't see through it. So one thing that my students do is something called the 5-word rule. If you have 5 words in front of the quote, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, it should sound conversational. And then in my YouTube channel, I have a video on quote frames. You can see that this quote does not end the sentence. It keeps going on. So it says, suggesting that what he sees outside is already being filtered through recollection. So I like to see a variety of quote frames, and my students get pretty good at that because it's something that we hammer quite explicitly. That blending continues as the natural world feels newly alive, with the 2 pear trees white again, their flowers ephemeral, showing how even seasonal change mirrors the fragility of thought and time. So you can see here, we give our kids space for quite a bit of commentary and quite a bit of space to do their textual analysis from their textual support. As the movement continues, the speaker relies on small external markers like squirrels, blue jays down trees for markers to measure progress, showing how observation and memory begin to overlap within the rhythm of motion. These repeated images make it feel like the environment is actively participating in the speaker's thinking, not just existing around him. Even the act of naming what he passes turns into a way of holding on to time as it moves forward. So now we're at the conclusion here. Again, wrap it back to the thesis, wrap it back to the prompt. Overall, these early moments establish how the speaker's experience is shaped by the way nature constantly triggers and holds memory within the flow of his physical movement. So all in all, you're taking about 10 sentences, 12 sentences. Ideally with this one, I think it could benefit from a little bit more commentary, but pretty good, all in all. So the question becomes, because the intro's done, the first body's done, what do I do next? And this is the glory of heuristics. You just do it again. You bust out another syllogism, and you might have a first premise like this. You're at about the middle of the poem. Just continue with the rest of the analysis. So a simple transition like, as the poem progresses, the focus shifts from external observation of nature to a deeper inward movement where memory becomes more personal and emotionally charged. A lot of my kids miss that. You got this big shift from outer to inner. The speaker's physical struggle through space begins to mirror an internal struggle with recollection, suggesting that movement itself triggers a return to intimate past experiences. This shift marks a transition in which memory is no longer just connected to the natural world, but becomes tied to human relationship and emotional continuity. So what do you do with that? Again, the first premise is a promise. So I tell my kids to go quote hunting, get your textual support, get your quotes and your paraphrases all lined up, and just keep that line of reasoning perfectly intact. So that would take us through body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, and that's all my kids do. They do 4 paragraphs for the essay. So let's talk about wrapping it up and tagging a conclusion on it. My students use stems for this, and I give the following analogy, especially early in the year. Basically, the conclusion is akin to a fireworks display, the grand finale. So you want all-encompassing, all-encapsulating statements like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day. So here's an example of one, and it just takes 3 or 4 sentences. Simply said, the poem reveals how physical movement and natural surroundings become the gateway through which memory returns and deepens. What begins as a simple jog unfolds into a layered experience where the present constantly opens into the past. Ultimately, marking time shows how everyday motion can carry emotional history, allowing fleeting moments to hold lasting human connection. All right. And that's the whole essay. That's the kit and caboodle right there. So hopefully you guys like these heuristics and see the potential in them. We've been using them for decades now, and our kids do really well on the exam when they can manipulate these and hone in on their reads. So if you got any questions, you can feel free to drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. The slides that you just saw are down below in the video's description if you would like to use them in your own writing workshops. And I'll make videos for the rest of the exam in the coming days. So be well for now, take care, and I'll see you around.